Now, I last taught Revelation. It was, some of you were here, no doubt. It was just over 10 years ago. Time flies. I mean, I started teaching it in December of 2012, and I think we went until May of 2013. So that's just a little over 10 years. And as I said then, I have a soft spot in my heart for the book of Revelation because it was instrumental in Meg's conversion. Now, I became a Christian on June 14th, 1978. Came out of a completely pagan background. And as you can imagine, my conversion, it dramatically shifted the focus and direction of my life. And Meg wasn't entirely thrilled about that. It was as though somebody had stolen the man she'd married just 2 years before. So it was like pretty radical for her. And that was a tense time in our marriage. In fact, her friends were telling her that I had lost my mind. That was their diagnosis, that I had simply gone crazy. And talking to Meg about Christ, that quickly became off limits. In other words, she let it be known that she wasn't in for that. And so, now Brother John, he had a church in Gainesville, Florida, of about 1,000 people praying for Meg. And I came home one day and she just casually threw out, she said, I read some of Revelation today. Now, that wouldn't have been the place I would have recommended starting in Revelation. But at that point, for her to open the Bible anywhere, that was a major thing. And she finished Revelation, and I do think she'll tell you that it frightened her. She finished it, and it frightened her, and then God used that fear of His judgment to stir her to pursue Him. And on September 17th, 1978, which was one of the greatest days of my life, Meg was baptized into Christ. Now, despite knowing very little about the Bible at that time, Meg absorbed the take-home message from the symbolic drama that is the book of Revelation. There's much in the apocalyptic portion of Revelation, from chapter 4 and following, that's uncertain in terms of details. But it's not necessary to understand all the details to profit from the book. What comes through loud and clear in the book of Revelation is that God is in control of history, that He prevails over every enemy, and He is going to bring His creation to the perfect eternal state as He has promised. Those who are faithful to Him will share in that blessing. Those who are not will suffer terrible wrath. Now, Vern Poythress, in his little book on Revelation titled The Returning King, he illustrates the point with a story about some seminary students who were playing basketball. They just finished playing ball in a gym, and they noticed a janitor over in the corner of the gym reading a book. And they shouted out to him, "What are you reading?" He said, "Well, the Bible." And they said, "What part of the Bible?" And he said, "Revelation." And they figured they'd help this guy out. And they said, "Well, do you understand what you're reading?" And to their surprise, he said, "Yes." And they were quite taken aback. They said, "Well, what does it mean?" And he said, "Jesus is going to win." Now, beyond that, and I think that's right. You see, but beyond that basic message, Revelation, as you know, can be quite puzzling. It has all kinds of strange symbolism, weird beasts, bizarre imagery, and shifting scenes. It's like a dream in that regard. Or it's like a video that bombards you with shifting symbolic imagery. And yet it carries this powerful message from God. And because of its distinctive nature in terms of New Testament documents, because of its distinctive nature, it seems that it's either ignored or it's fixated upon. And regarding the latter, William Barclay, he lamented that Revelation, quote, has sometimes become the playground of religious eccentrics. And that's certainly true. There are people that just, camp on Revelation, make claims about it all the time, create all kinds of things. Their whole world is there as though they're prophets themselves. But I think in churches of Christ, our tendency has been to ignore it. Not always, obviously, but I think that's how we tend. Now, as always, I'm going to give you my understanding of the book. That's just how I roll, okay? Now, there are things that I'm not certain about, and I'm well aware that there's plenty of room for disagreement with my understanding. I own 43 commentaries on the book of Revelation, and I have a lot of other books, systematic theologies and these kinds of things, that discuss the book of Revelation. And there is much disagreement among those scholars. What I ask, as always, is that you just relax, try to hear me out and try to understand, why does he think the book is saying what he thinks it's saying? Just understand get my understanding of it. Once you have that clear, instead of resisting it, fighting it, just take a deep breath, hear how I understand the book, so then once you've absorbed that, then you can evaluate it. And you can then say, I think that's truth. I think that's the Word of God. Or you can say, no, I don't think that's right. Okay? So that's what I ask that you do. Now, I want to assure you that the understanding I'm going to be presenting to you is not novel. Okay? It's not eccentric. I'm not leading you down some bizarre theological path. I may have a few different takes or wrinkles thrown in, but the basic view that I'm presenting is in the evangelical mainstream. Okay? So you need to know that. It may be new to you, but it's well known by other people. Okay? So if what I'm presenting to you is something that you say, well, I haven't heard Revelation understood that way. Okay. Like I say, just listen to it and then you judge whether what I'm saying is true. Now, for those who may be invested in a different interpretation, okay, so some people they say, look, I already have this book wired, I figured it out. Okay, so those who may be invested in an interpretation different than the one I'm going to be presenting, I want to alert you to where I'm headed, so you can decide whether being in the class will be worth the aggravation to you. Okay? Because as I'm sitting here presenting something and you think that I'm off my rocker, you may be sitting there just going, all right, well, I'm going to give you a little disclosure early where I'm headed, so you can make that assessment, because I don't want you throwing things at me. I don't want you gnashing your teeth at me, so you can make that decision. I'll say more about this shortly, but let me just say now that I think there is a strong, in terms of my presentation and how I see the book, I think there is a strong futurist element in Revelation. In other words, I think that much of the apocalyptic material, much of the visionary material after chapter 3, I think it relates to the end of history, to the second coming of Christ, and to the period of intense distress that will immediately precede that coming. And I think the events that are associated with the opening of the first 5 seals of the scroll in chapter 6, I think those events are the birth pains that mark human history until the return of Christ. Then the opening of the 6th of the 7 seals points to the contents of the scroll that will eventually be opened after you break the 7th seal. You can't get into the scroll until all the seals are broken. So the first 5 I see as representing the birth pains throughout history until the coming of Christ. The breaking of the 6th seal and the things associated with that are pointing to the contents of the scroll. And then the focus of the scroll, the contents of which are not revealed until the breaking of the 7th seal, that is the second coming of Christ and its accompanying circumstances and judgment. Okay, so I'd probably be classified as a modified futurist. I disagree with those who think that the events that are symbolized prior to chapter 19, that those have already been fulfilled. There are people that think that. I'm not one of them. Okay, so I'm telling you up front, I think there is a significant futurist element to the book. Now, I'm also what is known as an amillennialist. Okay, now that probably should be called a realized millennialist, because amillennialists suggest that you don't really think there's a millennium. I do. I just think it's ongoing. It's realized. But, I don't get to set theological terminology, so it's called amillennial. So I would be categorized as an amillennialist, that's a common understanding, by the way, in Churches of Christ, probably the common understanding in Churches of Christ, also in a number of other groups. And that means that I believe that this 1,000-year reign, okay, the millennium, that millennial reign that's mentioned in Revelation chapter 20, I think it's a picture. It is a symbol of the present reign of Christ and the saints in heaven. Christ's return will mark the end of that period, and then the final state will be ushered in. And I don't remember where I took this diagram from, but you see we're in this 1,000-year period. We have this intense period here, the second coming and all that's involved, the judgment, and then you enter into the eternal state of the new heavens and new earth. Okay, so with many other people, I'm amillennial. Now, this is in contrast to premillennialists. There aren't many of those, I think. That's certainly a very small number of people in Churches of Christ. But it's in contrast. It's a significant number of people elsewhere. But it's in contrast to premillennialists who believe, among other things, that Christ's return will precede a literal 1,000-year reign on earth. In their views, Christ will return, and then he will rule over a peaceful and prosperous earthly kingdom for 1,000 years. And some would say, well, the 1,000 years is just symbolic of a long time. But his return, he precedes his earthly reign of this peaceful and prosperous kingdom for 1,000 years, after which time then there's this final rebellion and then the judgment and the final state. But there are really two main types of premillennialists. I'm not going to go into this a lot, but just to touch it, there are really two main types of premillennialists. Okay, progressive dispensationalists may disagree and say they want to be in there. But historically, the two main types of premillennialists that you have is historic premillennialists and dispensational premillennialists. And the historic premillennialists, you see, they think here you have the second coming, and then you have this 1,000-year reign of an earthly kingdom. Christ is ruling. Then you have this outbreak. Then you have the final judgment and the final state. The dispensational premillennialists, they're both premillennialists because they think the return of Christ precedes a 1,000-year earthly reign. Whereas I think the return of Christ, all millennialists say when Christ returns, that's going to be the judgment and entering into the final state. Okay, that the millennial reign is this symbolic church age. So he comes eternal state. The premillennialists, having come, earthly reign of 1,000 years, and then we have the final coming. But the difference between the dispensational premillennialists and the historic premillennialists is, these are like some of these popular books you've seen. The dispensationalists, you have a secret return of Christ. Then you have the church get sucked up. That's why you see those bumper stickers in the case of the rapture, the car will be unmanned and this kind of thing. So you're going to be sitting here. That's why I joke around a lot of times. I won't see somebody, I say, I must have missed the rapture. See, because all of a sudden there are going to be these people, they're going to be gone. Because that's the secret return of Christ, where these believers get sucked up so they avoid the tribulation and the hardship. And so they get taken up, and then you have the return of Christ, then you have, his return, 1,000 years. So really you have two returns. You got the secret return, then you have this return, then you have 1,000 years, then you have the outbreak, the judgment, and eternal state. So it's a little more complicated. Okay, now there's also what is known as postmillennialists. Okay, I disagree with postmillennialists, but a little bit in common with them. I mean, it's not terribly different, but you see their idea is that, look, the church age is the gospel is going to spread and things are going to get better and better. And then we're going to have a Christianized world for 1,000 years. We're going to have a golden age through the spread of the gospel. So basically things are going to get better and better than this golden age of 1,000 years. And then Christ will come and we'll have the judgment in the eternal state. Okay, so those are just large categories. I'm somebody who's an all-millennialist, and though these millennial disagreements, they have been prominent at different times in church history, they shouldn't be allowed to obscure. Whatever you think on these things, those disagreements should not be allowed to obscure the major point that the victory Christ has won over Satan will fully and finally be realized in the end, and that even before that time, God cares for his saints and blesses them in his triumphant rule. Okay? Those things, whatever you think, we should all be able to agree on that last part that I said. Okay? Though these disagreements have been intense at times. All right, so that's your warning. If neither of those perspectives, futurism or amillennialism, makes you hot under the collar, then I think you're going to be all right, and you may even learn something. Now, I'm going to spend today and the next class, and dare I say maybe even into the next class. I know that you don't like that, but I'm going to do that on introducing the book. And I say ad nauseum that introduction or introductory material, it's not filler. If I thought it was a waste of time, I wouldn't do it. You see, but it helps set the book, and it helps us in our interpretation of the book. So that's why I go through it. And what I'm going to do, in addition, in this section, in addition to standard introduction issues, like, who wrote it, when was it written, to whom was it written, and those kind of standard introductory things, I want to take the time to give you a brief overview of the story of the Bible. Okay? I think that's very important because Revelation is part of, indeed, it is the culmination of that story. So we need to read theologically. What is the story instead of just seeing the Bible as just piecemeal? I want to give you this overarching story of the Bible so we can then look and see how Revelation fits in. See, from Genesis to the end, it is the consummation of the story. And so I want to paint that for you, and that may take me a little while. Now, when we begin our study of the text, when we actually get to the text, which will be a while, but when we do that, I'll try to move things along at a good pace, meaning I'll try to strike a balance between getting bogged down in minutia and skimming too quickly over the text. As you know, it's fairly lengthy, the book, so I'm guessing our journey is going to take us, from the time I taught it last time, I'm guessing it'll take us 6 months maybe. But I prepare things and I teach things, and when I'm finished, I'm finished. Okay, so if it's 6 months, it'll be somewhere around there, I think. All right, let's talk about the authorship. All right, I'm convinced Revelation was authored by the Apostle John. And there are several lines of evidence in support of that view. The author in the book, he identifies himself simply as John, which suggests that he's well known to the readers, right? I mean, when he can simply say, John, and he expects those to whom he's writing to know who he is, well, he's not going to be some obscure guy, because you'd be certain to be, people would miss who you were. So you have to have some prominence if you're just going to say John, and you expect people to know who you are. And reliable early church tradition places the Apostle John in Ephesus at the end of his life. And no other Christian named John would have been better known to the churches in the province of Asia in the late first century than the Apostle John. Okay? No other Christian named John would have been better known. Donald Guthrie, in his introduction, New Testament introduction, he says, was the Asiatic church overrun with brilliant Christians by the name of John, who would only need to announce their name for the Christians to know which was meant? Okay, so this idea already, I'm thinking, John, it's the Apostle John. He's the one who would be known. And ascription of revelation to the Apostle John is early and it's widespread. Okay, so in church writings, you have several second century writers and works. They make the claim that it was authored by the Apostle John. And they do so without any hint that there's a contrary claim. In other words, when they say very early, so we're talking second century people and writings, and they don't say, by the way, it's written by the Apostle John, contrary to what these people think, or contrary to it. No. It's just said as a matter of fact. And so Revelation, as I'll explain, I believe, is written in the mid-90s. We're in the second century, and everybody's saying John wrote it, the Apostle John. All right, well, that's significant. Now, their evidence is especially strong, okay, given that Papias, there's some question about whether he's making the identification, so he's somewhat disputable. But Papias and Melito and Irenaeus, people I put up there, you see that they were in a good position to know. So it's not simply that we have this second century testimony. We have second century testimony from people who are in a good position. You'd think they'd be in a good position to know, was it written by the Apostle John? Papias knew the Apostle John personally. And Melito was bishop of Sardis, which is one of the churches addressed in the book of Revelation. Irenaeus was from Smyrna, which is another of the churches addressed in Revelation. And Irenaeus claimed to have heard, when he was small, to have heard Polycarp, who had talked with the Apostle John. All right, so we're getting very close here. So you'd think that they'd be in a good position. No. And then we have third century Christian writers. So in the 200s, we have third century Christian writers who ascribe revelation to the Apostle John. And they include Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus, Origen, Tertullian. So you have this. You have him just identifying himself as John. The fact John is in Ephesus at the end of his life. You have these early ascriptions from the second century from people you think would be in a really good position to know. You have this explanation or ascriptions from the third century. And then there are linguistic and stylistic clues in the text that have convinced the majority of scholars that the author of Revelation was a Jewish Christian originally from Palestine. Okay, now people who play in this world and can make these kinds of assessments, most scholars accept that we can detect in here how he's using Greek and this kind of thing, that the author was a Jewish Christian from Palestine, and that of course fits the Apostle John. So we have another thing there. Now the most significant early dissenting voice regarding the Apostle John's authorship was a man named Dionysius. Dionysius was a 3rd century bishop in Alexandria, Egypt. Now, he didn't claim there was a different historical tradition. In other words, he doesn't say, no, this line, people have long thought this, and here's a competing historical claim about who wrote the book. He doesn't say that. Okay? Everybody seems to be saying John wrote the book. The Apostle John wrote the book. Rather, what Dionysius says, he says, look, the Greek is different. He says, I'm down with the fact that the Apostle John wrote the Gospel of John, and he wrote 1 John. But when I compare the Greek of Revelation to that of the Gospel and 1 John, it seems clearly a different hand is at work here. And so that was the argument that he made. The Greek style, it differs from what you see in the Gospel and in 1 John. Now, many modern commentators agree with Dionysius on that point. Okay, so you'll have a lot of modern commentators who will say it was some unknown John or something like that. But I think Carson and Moo, in their introduction to the New Testament, they have it right. They say, while the difference in Greek style is a problem, in other words, it's something that has to be answered. How do we account for that? And there are ways of skinning that cat. Okay, that you can say, well, I don't think that's all that likely. You say, but do you think it's all that likely in view of all of this weight of testimony from people who are in a really good position to know? You see, do you think it's sufficient to overcome that objection in light of these things? That's the question. So they say, while the difference in Greek style is a problem, we're not convinced that the arguments of Dionysius or his latter-day followers make it impossible for the same person to have written both the fourth gospel and Revelation. We are thus inclined to accept the testimony of those who were in a position to know about these matters, and we attribute both books to John the Apostle, the beloved disciple. I think that's right. Okay, I go through this, though, because in your travels and your discussions and things, you'll run into people who will say, no, you don't even know this, And so I want you to be tuned into what are some of the questions, what are some of the issues, why think the Apostle John is in fact the author of it. Now the date, when is it written? I mean, there are really only two serious contenders for the date Revelation is written. And one is that they're shortly after the reign of Nero, Roman Emperor Nero. So you've got shortly after his reign in AD 68 or 69. That's a possibility, I think, quite remote. But the only two serious contenders are 68, 69, right after the reign of Nero, and near the end of Emperor Domitian's reign in 95, 96. Now, in agreement with a clear majority of scholars, I think the AD 95, 96 date has considerably stronger support. Okay, I'm in the mid-90s is when I think this is happening. Now, this date receives the earliest and the most support from early Christian writers. Irenaeus, he writes in the 2nd century that Revelation was written toward the end of Emperor Domitian's reign. So he's pretty close to the situation. He says it's written near the end of his reign. He was in a position to have direct information about that. As I said, he was from Smyrna, one of the churches addressed in Revelation. He claimed to have heard Polycarp, who had direct contact with the Apostle John. And Eusebius, the church historian, the Greek theologian, Eusebius reports that Melito, who was bishop of Sardis in the 2nd century, another church addressed in Revelation, he agreed that Revelation was written during Domitian's reign. Now, wouldn't you think that it's addressed to Sardis? This guy's a bishop in Sardis. Wouldn't you think that they would know when that letter, they'd have kept that alive that long? When was the letter written? That seems pretty weighty to me. Others supporting that dating include Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Victorinus, Eusebius, and Jerome. Now, the book also, in furtherance of this idea that it's in the mid-90s rather than that other option of 68 or 69, the book indicates that emperor worship was practiced. And you see that indicated in a number of places in chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, 19, and 20. So emperor worship is something that's being practiced. And though there were elements of that, there were elements of emperor worship going back to Julius Caesar, emperor worship reached new heights under the Emperor Domitian. It became a whole different kind of thing. Bruce Metzger, in his commentary on Revelation, Metzger says, prior to Domitian, the state religion had not discriminated against the Christian faith. Nero's mad acts against Christians were restricted to Rome and had nothing to do with the issue of worship. The first emperor who tried to compel Christians to participate in Caesar worship was Domitian. Okay, so he's like taking this to a different level. This idea of the Caesar, the Roman emperor, is divine in some way, and I want you to come and confess and acknowledge that as part of the unity of the society. So he takes this to a different level. Now, the Roman historian, I always pronounce his name Suetonius, but it may rightly be Suetonius, but that seems weird. Okay, so the Roman historian Suetonius, who's born in around AD 70, he writes in the early part of the 2nd century. All right, so Revelation 95, 96, Suetonius is writing in the early part of this, not long after. He's writing there in the early part. He says that Lord and God became Domitian's regular title in writing and conversation. So this is how he was. It reminds me of that thing like Maestro in that old Seinfeld. I happen to know that he was referred to as Maestro in social settings. You know, this guy's Lord and God when he's talking. That's how you're to address this person. And Kostenberger, Kellum, and Quarles in their introduction says, in the accounts of Nero's conflicts with Christians, there's no evidence that Nero claimed to be divine. Okay, so I'm saying this because this seems to fit with the 95, 96 dating, because we have this pressure from emperor worship, and Domitian seemed to take that concept to a new level. And so that seems to fit better. Carson and Moo, in their New Testament introduction, said Domitian apparently made this confession of Domitian as Lord and God. He apparently made that confession a test of loyalty. So I want to see, you going to be in or out? You come and you confess me as Lord and God. He makes it a test of loyalty. He says, it is indeed possible that some Christians tried to avoid the predicament this placed them in by taking refuge in the synagogue, where some of the traditional legal exceptions granted Jews in this regard still applied. Okay, so you can see that because Jews had been grandfathered in, that they had certain religious liberties and protection, that you can't have them participate in idolatry and this kind of thing. So they're speculating that this may have driven some of the Christians to come get into the synagogue and identify here to bring themselves within the umbrella of that protection, that grandfathered in thing. And they go on and say this may help explain the tensions between Jews and Christians evident in the letters to the 7 churches. So this may have been stirring up trouble because the Jews may have been saying, hey, they're not part of us. They're a different thing. So have at them. We see how that would cause some real tension. Now, Colin Hemmer, Carson and Moo point out, Colin Hemmer, after an exhaustive study of the local settings of the churches, the 7 churches, in the work, The Letters to the 7 Churches of Asia in their local setting, claims that his findings generally confirm the Domitianic date. In other words, it's during the time of Domitian, this 95, 96 time. For example, well, what kinds of things are you talking about? Laodicea, one of the churches to whom the letter's written. Laodicea was leveled by a devastating earthquake in AD 60 or 61. And that city, it was rebuilt without assistance from Rome, but it was decades before the rebuilding of Laodicea reached a level that would justify Revelation's description of Laodicea as a rich and economically flourishing city. It was destroyed in 60 or 61, rebuilt without help from Rome, but it wasn't rebuilt so fast that you could properly describe it that way by 68. So it's longer after that. I mean, its great stadium in Laodicea wasn't completed until AD 79, and its other grand public buildings, they were constructed around that time, a long time after 61, AD 79. And its triple gate and its towers, they probably weren't finished until AD 88 or 90. And Mark Hitchcock, in his contribution, his chapter in the book, The End Times Controversy, Hitchcock says, if Revelation was written in AD 95, the description of Laodicea in Revelation 3:14-22 would fit the situation exactly. By this time, the city had been completely rebuilt and was enjoying prosperity and prestige and basking in the pride of its great accomplishment. Now, also, I think that the lack of any mention of Paul or Timothy in the letter to the church in Ephesus, that seems to me to be more compatible with a dating in the 90s rather than a dating in the 60s. I mean, I recognize that's an argument from silence. But I mean, given that how long Paul had labored in Ephesus, and given that Timothy was combating false teaching in Ephesus in the mid-60s, I mean, it just seems to me that a letter that was written so close to that time would somehow, in some way, acknowledge their service to the church in Ephesus. Now, I can't prove that, but that's how it smells to me. You see, that when you're further down the road, it makes more sense to me that that wouldn't be mentioned. But if we're writing right in the 60s, I would expect them to be acknowledged. Now, to the extent Revelation alludes to what is known as the Nero Redivivus myth, okay, the Nero Redivivus myth, which it probably does allude to it, seems quite likely. Well, that favors a date during Domitian's reign, because this idea of Nero returning, that idea increased significantly in popularity toward the end of the first century. And the more that idea of a returning Nero, the more that was in the cultural wind, the better suited it would be to serve as a symbolic reference. Right? The more people are tuned into that and are aware of that, well, now it's fodder for me to use it symbolically. But if it's kind of esoteric and only a few people are tuned into it, well, I'm kind of wasting it. You see, so that's another thing that points me to the 90s seem better. Now, the reference in Revelation 11, 1 and 2 to the temple, and the reference in 17:9-11 to the sixth king as presently reigning, we'll talk about that, Lord willing. But they do not require a Neronic, a Nero date, and aren't sufficient in my judgment and the judgment of many other people, most people in fact, to overcome the evidence for the dating during the reign of Domitian. Okay, so they don't do that. Now, Kostenberger, Kellum, and Quarles, in their New Testament introduction titled The Cradle, the Cross, and the Crown, they conclude, they say, the external testimony overwhelmingly favors the late date, which became the established tradition throughout church history. The internal testimony, while less than conclusive, also tends to support a later date. Although some passages may reflect historical circumstances prior to 70, most of the evidence seems to point to a later date. The book of Revelation was written around 95, 96 by John in obedient submission to the vision he received while in exile on Patmos. I think that's right. Okay, so I said all that to tell you I agree with that. Okay? Now let me give you where John's situation. First, here's kind of a big view, a high view here of so we have Asia Minor here, right? This peninsula out here between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. This is Asia Minor. And here is this province, this Roman province of Asia, which is in the westernmost part of this peninsula of Asia Minor. Okay, so we're going to be focusing here is Asia, and here you get kind of a close-up of that province there in Asia. So John, he's on the island of Patmos, to which he's most likely been temporarily banished there by a local Asian official. So he's out there, he's on Patmos, he's been banished there because of opposition to his message. You see that in chapter 1, verse 9. He's there because of the word of his testimony. He's been sent and exiled to Patmos, probably temporarily, probably by a local Asian official. Now, exile or banishment to an isolated island, that was a relatively common form of punishment in the Roman Empire. And the sentence, you could either make it permanent, it's a death sentence, or you could make it temporary. But if it was going to be permanent, then that verdict required approval from the emperor. Only he was somebody who was going to give the guy a death sentence, a death exile. If it was temporary, well, then it could be done by a local Asian official, and that seems to be what happened here. The island of Patmos, that's marked there on that map, it's about 10 miles long, 6 miles wide, with rocky terrain. It's about 40 miles west of Miletus, about 60 miles southwest of Ephesus in the Aegean Sea. And the island was inhabited It was inhabited, but John's presence there was a forced separation from the mainland. In other words, he was exiled there. He was sent there as punishment. And the fact that Tertullian says that John's exile was of the temporary variety. So we have Tertullian, who's writing in the turn from the 2nd to the 3rd century. He says that he was exiled there temporarily. That allows us to infer that his sentence had been pronounced by a local official, because the local officials could do that. So this local Asiatic official doesn't like what John is saying, and he boots him to Patmos for some time as punishment. Now the recipients, Revelation was written at the Lord's command to the 7 churches in the Roman province of Asia that are highlighted there in green. And the cities in which these churches are located, they were on a postal route. They were on a postal route in that province. And since the number 7, it symbolized completeness or perfection. The 7 churches could symbolize all the churches in Asia, because I'm sure they were all experiencing similar things. And the saints in these locations, they are in need of encouragement. They're in need of encouragement to remain faithful as they face the pressure of a culture, and increasingly the pressure of a political power. Right? I mean, sometimes the culture says you're weird, we don't like you, you're on the outs. But also sometimes the political power gets involved. And so they're facing this pressure from culture, and increasingly pressure from a political power that was hostile to Christianity. So they're being pressured to compromise their commitment to Christ in order to get along in a world that was opposed to them. And brothers and sisters, I just got to say, this fits us. This page here, this page is turned, right? So we are increasingly considered harmful to the society, harmful to the culture, bigoted, hateful. We need to be squelched. And more and more you're starting to see political powers come in and say, well, wait a minute, what is this group doing? What is this group doing? Don't think these things don't happen. Human beings are sinful. The world hates Christ. And by my lights, the page is turning, and we are more and more coming into their situation, which I think will help us in really seeing and feeling the message. All right, I'm over time. Thank you.